Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 112, and this is for our class for Tuesday, the 2nd of March. And where we are is talking about our first major drama, Oedipus the King, and also getting ready for our first paper, which happens to be on short story. So at this particular point, I should have returned the short story journal to you. Any short story journals that were submitted to me by Friday, the 26th, should have been returned to you, so that if it turns out that you haven't had that returned to you, please let me know. And then I'm working on any journals I received over the weekend and the beginning of this week to get that back to you as soon as possible. Hopefully those journals will give you an idea of ways that you could proceed with your paper. And as I indicated with the first paper, because we had a bit of an extension for the journal, we'll also have a bit of an extension for the paper. So the paper will now be due a week from now on Tuesday, the 9th of March, though you can certainly submit in early papers via PDF to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. The paper, unlike the journal, will be graded formally, so it will be reviewed for not only content, but grammar and mechanics, and then I will put a good number of comments on it and a letter grade, and then return that back to you. And if you would like to do so, you can rewrite that first paper for a higher grade. I just ask that you submit in the original graded version that I had returned to you, along with your revision, as soon as possible, but by the ending of the semester. And certainly if you aren't sure about how to proceed by incorporating my comments or doing a revision, contact me and I'll be happy to give you further direction. And then you should get the higher of the two grades, and that would be hopefully the revision grade. I believe that should be the revision grade. I've never had it not be the revision grade. So if you're feeling a little bit of anxiety about the first paper, keep in mind you can think of it as a kind of draft, which you can rewrite. And for our preparing for Oedipus the King, as you know, we have several classes devoted to each of the plays, and the play is included in our textbook, but you can see in the notes below, I also have a link where you can access that particular play. Now, we are reading a translation, so each translation will be slightly different. It'll be based on how the editor decided to translate the story. And this is particularly tricky because Oedipus the King, much like some of Shakespeare, was written in poetry. So when you're doing a translation, you're trying to keep to the rhythms and the sounds of the poetry, but you're also trying to keep to the plot and the content. And I can't necessarily say that one translation is better than another, but in terms of this play, the reason why I wanted us to review it is because of its historical significance. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the author, Sophocles, and there's some readings in our textbook about him that I assigned starting on page 1120. And he's from Athens, Greece, from 400s BC, a statesman, a general, and a dramatist. And there are over 120 play fragments, a handful are intact. And luckily, we do have the Oedipus trilogy, because Oedipus is part of a trilogy. And the first play is Oedipus the King, which is the play that we are going to be reading. The second is called Antigone, which is the story of Oedipus's adult daughter. And then the third is called Oedipus at Colonus, where we revisit the character Oedipus as an old man. And I believe you've got Antigone in your textbook, but you don't have Oedipus at Colonus, but you can find all three online if it turns out that you wanted to read them. Now, these would be the very early days of drama, and that meant that many of the things that we take for granted wouldn't have been created yet. In fact, Sophocles' claim to fame, or one of his claims to fame, is that he included a third actor on stage so that dramatic performances could be more complex. And the role of the chorus would be reduced. And the chorus was basically much like what you would think of in a Broadway musical with a chorus. A large group of people who, rather than singing, they would be chanting, and that large group of people would all be chanting in unison. That would help to increase their volume so that it would be easier to hear. If you remember, there wasn't necessarily the modern technology in Greek amphitheaters that we've got today. So no electricity, no lighting, none of those things. So things like volume would have been a challenge at the time. And the chorus could act much like the populace, in other words, the citizenry, and they could also act as narrators and comment on the action. And usually we see both in terms of the course. The whole point of drama was as a religious festival to the god Dionysus, the god of wine and fertility. Keep in mind that this is a society of gods in the plural. And theater was funded by the state because it was seen as a religious observance as well as a way to reinforce community values. So there was an educational element associated with this. And if you've ever seen a picture of the Greek amphitheater, you can know how large these amphitheaters were. They could seat over 14,000 individuals. There would be rows of rising seats in hillsides. I've never had the pleasure of going to Greece or seeing a Greek amphitheater in person, but I have seen videos, and they're supposed to be marvels in terms of acoustics. And again, that helps in terms of the carrying of the sound because they wouldn't have been electronic devices. Now, that said, because we didn't have the kind of technology, or they didn't have the kind of technology that we do today, they were using some rather unusual theatrical conventions. So, first of all, the actors would be dressed in very strange costumes, they would be very colorful. They would be large and padded. The actors would be likely standing on stilted shoes to increase their height, so that would increase their visibility on stage. They would also be wearing masks, and those masks would denote a particular facial expression. Again, those masks would make it easier to differentiate one character from another. And within the mask, it's thought that there was some kind of an amplification device so that when individuals were speaking or chanting, then that would increase the volume. Now, eventually, we are going to see a performance of Oedipus the King, and the performance that I wanted to show you tries to mimic what it is that we would have experienced in a Greek amphitheater in the 400s BC. So it's going to be an incredibly unusual experience. And my suspicion is that you probably won't care for it very much. The point of watching it isn't so much to understand the plot. In fact, the audience would have already known the plot ahead of time so that they didn't have to concentrate too hard on the plot. Because again, it would have been difficult to see and it would have been difficult to hear. And we're going to also make sure that we know the plot ahead of time before we see a performance. Instead, it's to get a sense of the way that actors would have incorporated their dramatic skills into presenting the dialogue of the plays. And you'll remember that we talked about one of the major ways that plays are different from other literary vehicles is that they are dialogue driven. So this is the way that we need to get information as audience is through dialogue. The stage itself was very sparse, just about no stage props. Though there was something called Deus Ex Machina, which means God from the machine. That was a mechanical stage device where you could perhaps lower through a series of pulleys and ropes a character onto the stage. For instance, if you wanted to lower a character from the heavens, or you could do the opposite. You could raise a character from the stage up to the heavens. And it's become known now in contemporary times, Deus Ex Machina, as any kind of artificial device used to give quick resolution to a drama. Probably the most common would be at the ending of a particular story, having a character wake up and realize it was all a dream. So this would be a very artificial and quick way of giving some kind of resolution. So I don't know how well you know your 1970s television shows, but this is exactly what was done with a TV show called Dallas. And one of the central characters was killed off because of a contract dispute. And then they settled the contract during the summer and they had to bring back the actor and the character. But how to do that when they had killed the character off? And basically, the way they did it was that his wife was in bed asleep, and when she wakes up, he walks out of the shower and she tells him that she had a horrible dream that he died, and he laughs it off and he says, "Of course, I'm fine." And viewers were furious, but it worked at least in terms of being able to reincorporate this actor back into the particular storyline. So, in terms of the strange wardrobes, the masks, the padded costumes, the platform shoes, we can never know exactly for certain what exactly they would have looked like, but I think this performance that we'll be seeing will give you a clue that it's definitely quite alien to what we are expecting today. And the chorus, that chanting group, is also rather alien. We're not necessarily used to having a group of people chanting. And in some ways, they almost served as a kind of soundtrack, in the way that we wouldn't necessarily have, or they wouldn't have necessarily had at that particular time, an orchestra, but they could, through their chanting, provide some sort of a musical element to it. Now, the whole point, as I indicated, was that the audience would know the plot of the play ahead of time. And then ultimately, what we would do at the ending of the play is experience something known as catharsis. And that means that we could purge our emotions. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the plot of Oedipus the King because it is a very convoluted plot. In some ways, it's very much like a soap opera. And while it might seem quite removed from our contemporary times, I would suggest that many of the themes of the play are themes that still are relevant to our present day. But the play begins in media res, which means the play begins in the middle. And we have Oedipus the king, who is a great ruler, who is trying to solve the mystery of a plague in his particular kingdom. So he has sent out scouts to visit oracles to try to figure out why it is his community is being ravaged by plague. And all of the information that's coming back to him is basically that he himself, Oedipus, is responsible for the plague. And he denies it. He refuses to believe it. He becomes paranoid. He accuses individuals of lying, trying to steal his kingdom, and any of a number of other things. And then as the action of the play unfolds, we get some backstory. And eventually we learn that, yes, he is indeed responsible for the plague. So how did this all happen? And what we learn in backstory is that Oedipus, when he was a young man, had received a prophecy. And the prophecy was that he would kill his father, marry his mother. Horrified, he decided that what he needed to do to protect his parents was to leave home and go as far away as possible. Now, the twist that we find out later on is that Oedipus was adopted and he was never told. So the people that Oedipus leaves, the people he thinks are his birth parents, really aren't. At any rate, Oedipus in his journey comes across a crossroads that'll be thematically significant because he will be at a crossroads in his life as well. And in a fit of anger and temper, he ends up killing the individuals who are in a chariot, blocking his way. Or as I had a student once joke, perhaps this is the earliest literary reference to road rage. At any rate, he continues along until he encounters a community that had just recently lost its king, and it was ravaged by plague from this terrible monster called the Sphinx. And the only way the plague could be resolved, and remember, this is all backstory from the past, the only way the plague could be resolved is if the riddle of the Sphinx could be solved. And there's a long literary tradition of monsters having riddles, and that individuals, humans, would have to defeat these monsters by satisfying or in one way or another answering the riddle. And no one is able to answer the riddle. No one is smart enough to answer the riddle except for Oedipus. And the riddle, we find out, is that what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, 3 legs in the evening. And the answer, by the way, is man. 4 legs in the morning would be youth, a baby who crawls. 2 legs in the afternoon would be the adult who walks upright. And 3 legs in the evening would be that same person in old age walking with the king. But at any rate, Oedipus solves the riddle, and as a reward, he's given the community, because their king has recently died, and that means he also gets the queen's hand in marriage. They marry, they have children, and all is fine until, of course, the plague begins to ravage his community. And this is where the start of Oedipus the king is that he is trying to solve the riddle or the problem encountered by his community. Why is it that they're being subject to plague? And what we find out is that Oedipus obviously is responsible because he has angered the gods. How? Because he tried to outwit the gods. The gods have given him a fate. It was horrific, but rather than accept it humbly, he tried to change it. And as a result, he was punished for it. And as we get further backstory, this goes all the way back to Oedipus's birth parents when he was first born, because his birth parents consult an oracle, which was common at the time, and the oracle tells them that their baby will one day grow up to kill its father and marry its mother. And the birth parents are horrified, and they decide what they need to do is to give the child to one of their servants so the servants can kill the child, so that ultimately they can prevent this fate from occurring, which is what they do. But the servant takes pity on the baby and instead abandons the baby on a mountaintop. And it just so happens that that baby is found by the servant of another kingdom and is taken by that servant to the other kingdom, to the king and queen, who are childless. And they end up raising that baby as their own. And that baby is, of course, Oedipus. But they never tell that baby, who eventually becomes a man, that he is not their birth son. So Oedipus's birth parents are just as responsible for his fall as Oedipus himself is, because his birth parents, that includes his wife slash mother, Jocasta, basically, rather than accepting her fate from the gods, tries to outwit the gods. And while certainly there's justification to try to stop such a horrible thing from happening, at the time it would have been seen as hubris, excessive pride, to try to outwit the gods. So some of the contemporary questions that we have is what is pride, and what is fate, and can fate be changed? And ultimately, while we might have different conceptions about Oedipus, we have to remember what the Greek society would have felt in terms of Oedipus the king. And we should feel both pity for Oedipus, because ultimately it wasn't all of Oedipus's fault. He is a good man. He tried to avoid his fate. And we should also feel a certain level of fear, because if somebody as good and smart as Oedipus, after all, he solved the riddle of the Sphinx, could fall, well, then any of us could fall as well. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of Oedipus the king. As I said, this play is part of a trilogy. So the second play, Antigone, happens to be about Oedipus's daughter, because the way Oedipus the king ends, after he finds out the truth, he's horrified. And so is his wife slash mother, Jocasta. She runs off stage. She basically commits suicide. Oedipus finds her. Again, this happens all off stage. And he's so horrified is that he takes the brooches off of her wardrobe, gouges out his eyes, and then he's going to be exiled from the community forever. And this is going to be thematically significant, because the theme of vision and blindness, being able to see and not see, being in denial, is going to be an important element in the play. In fact, in the play, one of the prophets that Oedipus consults with is a blind prophet. He is physically blind, but yet he has insight. So the story, if we were to go on into the second play, Antigone, is the story of Oedipus's daughter slash sister, who grows up to be a woman, and her interactions with her family. And then the third, in the third play of the trilogy, Oedipus at Colonus, happens to be the story of Oedipus as an old man. He basically ends up fulfilling his prophecy, because even when he's a young man, at the ending of Oedipus the king, he's gouged out his eyes, so he basically needs a walking stick or 3 legs in order to be able to walk. But obviously, as an old man, he's using that walking stick as well as a kind of cane. And has he suffered enough so that the gods will forgive his transgressions? And you'll have to read the second and the third play to see what happens in terms of plot with those 2 particular plays. So why is this so important from a historical perspective? Because it helps to develop the definition of tragedy that we usually consider when we are talking about a dramatic vehicle. And on tragic character, which is on page 1165 of our textbook, is also a translation from, of all people, Aristotle. a name you might have heard of, a philosopher, but he also dabbled in literary criticism. And what you can see in this short excerpt that's in there is that he talks about what makes a great tragedy. And in fact, that a great tragedy should be complex, which makes sense because we've talked about how literature as a whole should be complex, unlike A Secret Sorrow, which was very simplistic. It should be terrible because it's tragic. It should be piteous, and that Oedipus the King is perhaps the finest example of tragedy that exists in the literary tradition, at least up until that point, because it helps to establish something called a tragic hero, which is what Oedipus exemplifies. A tragic hero is a great man, someone above and beyond the ordinary, someone that we can respect and admire, who experiences a downfall. And the downfall occurs for two reasons: because of a character flaw or flaws, let's say something like hubris or excessive pride, but also outside forces, things that are beyond that character's control. Call it fate, or call it luck, or call it destiny, whatever language you want to use. And then this person accepts responsibility for their role in their fall, even though they weren't completely responsible. And that's something that we see Oedipus do at the ending of the play by gouging out his eyes. In other words, he does not commit suicide and take the easy way out. He is intent on making sure that he lives a life of suffering and retribution. And the gouging out of the eyes, again, reinforces the theme of vision and blindness and light and dark that we see in the play. What can you see and what can you not see? And we as audience should feel pity for Oedipus, because it's a terrible thing that happened, and we should feel pity for the tragic character because it's a terrible thing that happened, because after all, they were good people above and beyond the ordinary. And we should also feel fear that if this person who is above and beyond the ordinary of ourselves, then can you imagine the kind of fall we would experience? Their fall is probably nothing compared to our fall. And that the characters that are presented should be engaged in necessary and probable actions. In other words, that they could seem as realistic as possible considering the limitations associated with drama. So if there was something that was unrealistic, then that should occur off stage. So things like monsters or suicides would occur off stage, and then we would find out about it in the dialogue, which is exactly what happens with Oedipus the King. Now, some of you who are taking psychology might be familiar with the term called the Oedipal complex. And Sigmund Freud, who's credited with being the father of psychology because he turned psychology into a kind of academic discipline, was very well read, and he used very loosely the play Oedipus the King to come up with his theory called the Oedipal complex. And Freud's theory of the Oedipal complex, it was that young boys have some sort of sexual attraction to their mothers and see their fathers as competition. Now, obviously, this is not what happens in the play Oedipus the King. As I indicated, Oedipus does everything in his power to avoid the prophecy from coming to fruition that he is going to kill his father and marry his mother. But Freud loosely took that plot and adapted it for his own purposes. And he also did the same for women. There's something called, according to Freud, an electrocomplex, where, according to Freud, young girls feel sexual attraction to their fathers and see their mother as competition. Now, these theories have been basically debunked in contemporary times, but again, Freud is given a good amount of status and respect, if for no other reason, because he helped to create the discipline of psychology. So you can see how literature has helped to inspire other things, such as psychology, and we see how philosophers have engaged in literary criticism when we talk about someone like Oedipus and Aristotle. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of Greek's theater, and also gives you a little bit of an idea of Sophocles and also Aristotle. What I thought we could do next class is to begin to talk a little bit more about the play and also the paper as well, because you will remember that our first paper is going to be due on the 9th, which happens to be Tuesday, because I gave an extension, 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email. And for today's attendance question, I wanted to return back to the paper. And you can answer this on our class discussion forum, and that would be due on Wednesday the 3rd at 10 a.m. And the question is, do you have any questions about paper number 1? And if so, what are those questions? Do you have any questions about paper number 1? And if so, what are those questions? So if you don't have any questions, just feel free to write no questions, and that'll satisfy your attendance. But if you do have questions, this is another way that you can reach out to me about that for paper number 1 for short story, as I encourage you to not only work on your first paper, but also to begin reading Oedipus the King. Even though we will be watching a production, again, that production, any production, is never a substitute for the play, but especially this particular production we are going to be seeing. You will see the acting is incredibly exaggerated. You will see there is a good amount of chanting. You will see that ultimately the actors are nothing like what you would expect in contemporary times, but this production can at least give you an idea of what someone might have experienced in 400 BC in terms of theater. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.